David had always been a skeptic. A scientist by trade, he'd spent his life dismissing the idea of extraterrestrial life as fantasy. But that was before he came across something he couldn't explain, a signal. It had been faint at first, barely perceptible amidst the static of deep space. Yet, it carried a pattern, a rhythm, something undeniably purposeful. At first, the signal seemed like a random anomaly. But as David analyzed the data further, his heart raced. It wasn't random at all. It was a message. A message that had been waiting for someone to hear it. Someone like him. The signal led David to a remote area in the mountains, where a strange, glowing doorway appeared out of nowhere, pulsating with an otherworldly energy. It wasn't there 1 minute and then it was. Standing at its threshold, David felt a chill crawl down his spine. This wasn't some human-made structure. It wasn't a natural formation either. It was a doorway, a gateway to something beyond his wildest imagination. The door shimmered, and though it looked as if it was made of nothing but light, it felt solid to the touch. As David stepped closer, he could hear faint whispers coming from the other side. The language was unfamiliar, but the tone was clear, an invitation, beckoning him to cross. Despite the doubt and fear clawing at him, David stepped through. As he passed through the door, the world around him twisted. His body felt weightless, as if he was floating through space itself, a sensation he could barely comprehend. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the scene had changed. Before him stood a landscape that was both familiar and alien. Towering structures, not quite like anything on Earth, stretched into the sky, made of materials that seemed to hum with energy. The air smelled strange, like ozone and something floral, like a world untouched by time. He wasn't sure if he was still on Earth, but what he did know was that he wasn't alone. A figure approached him. It was tall, its body translucent in the strange light, its eyes glowing with a soft blue intensity. It didn't speak, yet David understood its intentions. It extended a hand, welcoming him. "Who are you?" David asked, his voice trembling despite himself. The being didn't respond with words. Instead, it beckoned him to follow, leading him toward one of the towering structures. As David followed the mysterious figure, he tried to process the impossibility of it all. His scientific mind struggled to comprehend what his eyes were seeing. The beings here, they weren't human, yet they felt familiar. There was something about them that made him feel as though he was standing in the presence of an ancient memory. He couldn't explain it. The being led him into one of the enormous structures. The interior was vast, lined with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with life. David couldn't quite place it, but the walls felt alive, responding to his every movement. The more he looked around, the more it became apparent that this wasn't just a physical space, it was a convergence of time, space, and thought. They reached the center of the structure, where an enormous, glowing orb sat in the middle. The orb pulsed gently, radiating a soft light that seemed to fill the room. The being motioned for David to step forward. Hesitant, he obeyed, drawn to the orb as though it were calling to him. He reached out to touch it, and the moment his fingers made contact, a rush of visions flooded his mind. Images of planets, stars, and galaxies flashed before his eyes. But more than that, memories, long-buried thoughts, and emotions that weren't his own surged within him. It was as if the orb was showing him the history of the universe, from the moment of its birth to its eventual end. David gasped, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of it all. He staggered back, trying to regain his bearings. The figure stood silently, watching him with its glowing eyes. You've been waiting for me," David muttered, the realization dawning on him. The being nodded, its expression unreadable. It gestured to the orb once more, urging him to understand. David had always believed that humanity was alone in the universe. But what he saw through the orb shattered that belief. There were civilizations out there, ancient, advanced beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless worlds. And among them, there were those who had been watching Earth, waiting for the right moment to make contact. But there was something more. The orb wasn't just a repository of knowledge, it was a gateway to understanding. To becoming part of something much bigger than himself. And now, the time had come. David turned to the being, his voice filled with awe and fear. "What do you want from us?" From me. The being finally spoke, its voice like a whisper in his mind. We want you to help us. David blinked, confused. Help? With what? There are forces, the being continued, forces that seek to destroy what has been built. Forces that want to silence the knowledge of the universe. David's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What forces? The being didn't answer directly. Instead, it raised a hand, and the walls around them shifted. A hologram-like projection appeared, showing a darkened area of space, a void that seemed to devour everything in its path. It was a place of destruction, where light itself seemed to vanish. This is the shadow, the being said, its tone solemn. It is an entity of pure annihilation, and it is growing. If we do not stop it, the knowledge of the universe, everything, will be lost. David's mind raced. This was beyond anything he had imagined. The fate of the universe itself rested on his shoulders. David stood before the orb, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had always been a scientist, logical, methodical. This was beyond logic. He had just stumbled into a war between cosmic forces, one that was playing out on a scale he couldn't even fathom. And now, he was expected to play a role in it. The being stood silently, waiting. It had shown him the threat, the shadow, an entity that consumed everything in its path. It was already spreading, growing stronger with every passing moment. The beings of this world, of this dimension, had tried to stop it, but they were not strong enough. They needed help, human help. David took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. The choice was simple in theory: help them, or risk losing everything. But the cost, he knew, would be high. He wasn't sure if he was ready to sacrifice everything he knew for something as uncertain as this. The being reached out, placing a hand on David's shoulder. A surge of energy flowed through him, and suddenly, he understood. He saw it all, what had happened, what was at stake, and what he had to do. He looked at the being, and for the first time, he truly saw it not as an alien entity, but as a part of something much greater than himself. A part of the universe. A part of the story that stretched back eons. David nodded. I'll help you. The being smiled, or at least David thought it did, as its form shimmered with a soft glow. Then, together, we will stop the shadow. David stepped forward, placing his hand on the orb once more. This time, it didn't just show him the past. It showed him the future, the path forward, and the challenges ahead. He was no longer just a scientist. He was a part of something larger, something that stretched beyond the stars. As he prepared to step through the Galactic Door once more, David realized that humanity was no longer alone. The universe was full of allies, of knowledge, and of dangers. And now, he was a part of it all.